Okay, it's recording.
All right.
So first of all, I want to say thank you for your service.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So, is it okay if you could tell me about your life before you joined?
Yeah. I grew up in the New York City area, and then we moved out to Long Island, and I went to community college on Long Island. Then I went to a four-year institution in Wisconsin and finished up my bachelor's degree. Then I got a master's degree in Asian Studies Chinese from the University of Michigan. But I just couldn't find a job. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I didn't really have any connections with people who could help me out. So I thought, well, I'll go into the military, see how that works out. So I enlisted when I was 1983, when I was 25 years old. I enlisted in the Army. What's funny was I was actually going to go into the Marine Corps. They had a commissioning program, and this is before cell phones, right? So the way the Marines did it was you came in, you signed the paperwork, you did everything, and then the Marine major from the recruiting command would come to that office and swear you in. Well, I'm sitting there. What I didn't know, nobody knew, is he had a flat tire on the Belt Parkway in New York. And again, this is at rush hour, before there were cell phones. So he had no way to contact us. We had no idea where he was. So I'm sitting in the Marine recruiting office, and across the hall is an Army recruiter. And he sees me sitting there for an hour, 2 hours, and he leans over, he says, "Hey, what you doing?" I was like, "Oh, too late. Marine's already got me, you know." And he said, "Well," he said, "would you like a cup of coffee? You've been here a couple hours, you know." He's like, "What harm could a cup of coffee do?" All right. So I went across the hall. He gave me a cup of coffee, and then he started sort of like interrogating. Well, not really interrogating, but sort of eliciting information. Like, "So what are you doing?" "Well, I'm going to be an officer in the Marine." "Oh, that's great. Hey, you mentioned that you speak foreign languages." I'm like, "Yeah, I speak German and Chinese." He said, "Are the Marines giving you language training?" I said, "Well, no." He said, "Well, you come in the Army, we'll give you language training, right?" And he said, "Are they paying off your student loans?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, you come in the Army." So long story short, this recruiter basically conned me into not going into the Marines, but joining the Army. So this Marine major finally showed up. He was not in a good mood. He had a miserable afternoon. He finally got his car fixed, and he came to the office. So he came into the office. He's like, "Are you ready to get sworn in?" I'm like, "I think I need to sleep on it." So the next day I came in, I enlisted in the Army. So yeah, that's how I kind of went into that.
Wow.
Yeah, kind of nutty.
Okay. What was the training like for you?
Well, the way the Army worked at the time, first you went to basic training. Everybody goes to basic training. And the idea behind basic training is they tear you down as an individual and build you up as part of an organization, right? You learn to rely on your buddies, and they learn to rely on you, and all that stuff. So you do basic training, and then I went to interrogation school in Fort Huachuca, Arizona, and then I went to language school in San Francisco. They had main language school is in Monterey, California, which is also nice. But we were in what used to be an old Army hospital in San Francisco, and it was an awesome, like the best 8 months of my life, because I got sent out there to learn German, and I already spoke some German, so it wasn't academically too hard, and we were in a great location. So that was my training: basic training, interrogation training, and then finally language training.
What was your rank when you completed basic training?
When I completed basic training, I was a PFC, so I was an E3. So the way the enlisted ranks go, it's E dash whatever number. So because I had a graduate degree, I was a little higher rank. I was a private first class. Then I became a specialist later on. And then finally I became a sergeant when I was at Fort Hood, Texas. And after I left Fort Hood, Texas, I got commissioned in 1987. And I got commissioned as a second lieutenant. And by the time my 30 years were up, I was a lieutenant colonel.
Which unit were you in?
What unit?
Yes, throughout your service, which units were you in?
Okay, so I was with the 504th Military Intelligence Brigade, and they were at Fort Hood, Texas. And I was there for, so I did training for a year, and then I went to Fort Hood, Texas for 3 years, so 4 years altogether. After that, I was a reservist with the 310th Military Intelligence Brigade, sorry, 310th Military Intelligence Battalion, and the 800th Military Intelligence, keep saying intelligence, Military Police Brigade. So I was the intel officer in the reserves for a military police brigade. And then after that, I went to Defense Intelligence Agency, and I was a reserve attaché for them. I worked in Sarajevo in Bosnia. I worked in Berlin a lot of years, and that I did as a reservist. So I worked for DIA as a reservist. I also worked for them as a civilian as well at the same time.
So I learned that you saw the Berlin Wall being built. So describe your experience when you saw that.
Well, I didn't see it being built, but I saw it when it came down, right? So it was the 9th of November, 1989. And I actually had a meeting with a couple of East Germans that morning that had been able to come out to West Berlin. And it was kind of an interesting story because I knew the couple from West Berlin, and then the couple, their brother and his wife were able to come over from East Germany. And what's interesting is the Berlin Wall went up in August of 1961, and these two brothers had not communicated since then. They didn't visit each other because the problem was the brother in East Germany, he worked for the railroad, and he had access to what they called state secrets, right? So he knew about Soviet troop trains, he knew classified information. So the brother in West Berlin and he couldn't communicate directly because then the brother in East Germany might get arrested. So long story short, their mother lived in West Berlin. She passed away. The brother and his wife from East Germany were permitted to go to West Berlin for the funeral for 3 days. And they had to leave their kids behind, basically as hostages, to guarantee that they would come back again, right? Because this was a time where tens of thousands of East Germans were escaping to West Germany, right? So the East German government wanted to guarantee that these two individuals would go to West Berlin for the funeral, but then come back home again. So they came out for the funeral, and on the day that they went back to East Germany, I'm with the brother and his wife from West Berlin. The brother and his wife from East Berlin were at a bar downtown waiting for them to get on their train and go home. And again, these two brothers had not communicated or seen each other or talked to each other or written to each other for 28 years since the Berlin Wall went up. And they were convinced they'd never see each other alive again. So that day we put them on the train. There was a lot of crying, a lot of hugging. Everybody was kind of upset. They were convinced they'd never see each other again. Sent them back into East Germany. That afternoon, or even early evening, I think it was like 6:55 in the evening or 7 p.m. And there was a East German government official being interviewed on the TV. And they asked him at the end of an hour-long boring interview, they asked him, they said, hey, we understand that East Germany is going to revise its travel restrictions and that East German citizens will be allowed to travel to foreign countries. And he misspoke. What he said was, East German citizens, they'll be allowed to travel 30 days, no restrictions. And here's what happened. All of the people in East Germany heard this, and they're like, oh, we're going to be able to travel. So they all showed up at the border crossing points, not all of them, but I mean, a lot of East Germans, thousands of them, showed up at the border crossing points. I think there were 5 authorized border crossing points that were guarded by the East German security services, and they started showing up that night. And what happened was one of the border crossing sites, the guy on the ground, nobody could get an answer from the headquarters back home. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Do we shoot these people? Do we arrest these people? Do we let them go through? So finally, one guy at Bornholmer Strasse, he made the decision, I'm going to let the people go through. And once he let everybody go through, the other 4 border crossing sites did the same thing. So everybody kind of flooded into West Berlin. So what happened was word spread very quickly in East Germany. Hey, people are being allowed into West Berlin. It's happening right now. So the 2 people we put on the train to send home, they got off the train halfway home, took the train in the other direction, came back to Berlin, and we got together with them the next day. True story.
Wow,
Yeah, I still get chills, and this is 35 years later. And I still get chills thinking about that.
that, that's crazy. Um, Going back to when you were deployed, what did you do in Bosnia?
Well, in Bosnia, I worked at the U.S. Embassy. And in a U.S. embassy, just in general, you have a defense attaché office, and they represent the interests of the Department of Defense. So I had a boss, and he was the defense attaché. He was a colonel. I was a major at the time, and I was his assistant. So I was the assistant um, um, defense attaché, right? Assistant defense attaché. So in that capacity, I was able to literally travel all around the country, everywhere, every corner of that country. Which is very unusual because most of the military we had there, they were assigned to units and, they were doing their military functions. I was there in a representational capacity, which is very different, right? If you're a defense attaché. So that was very cool in Bosnia.
What else did you have to do while you were deployed to other countries?
Well, when I was in Afghanistan, I was what they called the J2X. I was the senior intelligence officer for the Joint Task Force that operated out of Bagram Air Base. We had most of our troops that were based at Bagram and at other locations throughout the country. But what I did, I was responsible for managing human intelligence operations throughout Afghanistan for the task force.
Was there a fight or a battle you were in?
Well, it's interesting because in my capacity at the headquarters, I traveled around a lot. I was there 2003, 2004 timeframe. So end of 2003, beginning first half of 2004. And when I was there, it was very different than what it became later on. I was traveling around with maybe one other person. We were armed, but we had a light, like a Toyota Hilux vehicle, not armored vehicle. And we could literally travel around the country pretty safely. That was then. It got worse later on. So I wasn't involved in any battles in that respect. Um, we had rocket attacks 6 times when I was at Bagram Air Base. I slept through all of them, because of where I was located. Next morning I go to breakfast and somebody say, "Hey, where were you in the air raid shelter last night?" I'm like, "What are you talking about?" Because I didn't hear anything. I was in a 40-foot container living by myself, and I just slept through all of it. So I had a pretty fortunate existence back then.
Were you ever injured?
No, not really.
What's one thing from your service that you will never forget?
There's a lot of things I'll never forget. When I was in the Pentagon and the plane hit the Pentagon on 9/11, I was working in the Pentagon. That I won't forget ever.
So I learned that you were 9/11 survivor. Are you okay with talking about your experience?
Yeah.
All right. When were you discharged?
July of 2013.
Did you have any long or short-term memories like PTSD?
No, not really.
Were there any medals or awards that you received?
Yeah, I mean, over 30 years, I got a bunch of awards. I got a Bronze Star. I got, I have a whole list of different awards that I received.
What's one that you're proud of?
Probably the Bronze Star, because that was one my dad had also gotten a Bronze Star. He was an infantryman in World War II, and he served in Italy, he served in France. So the fact that he had a Bronze Star, and that also I had one, that's kind of unusual, father and son both having that.
Wow. What was your life like after you were discharged?
Well, after I got discharged, I went back to work for Defense Intelligence Agency in a civilian capacity. I stayed in the reserves. Um, so then when I got discharged, I really did a kind of change careers because I transitioned from being a human intelligence officer full-time to academia. So I used to teach at Johns Hopkins. Then I've been here the last 3 years, 6 years, sorry, last 6 years here at Mercyhurst. So, and in between, I did competitive intelligence for 6 years. So if you do the math, you realize I'm older than dirt, but that's okay. You know, it's been a good ride.
Was the transition from being out of the military difficult?
It wasn't for me. It is for some people. I understand that. And part of the reason it wasn't difficult for me is because I was already in the military as a civilian. And I was an active. I was mobilized for 3 years after 9/11, right? So they brought me back onto active duty because of 9/11. That's why I went to Afghanistan. That's why I did other things. So it wasn't a hard transition because, like I said, what I was doing as a civilian was very similar.
Okay, so going back to you being a 9/11 survivor, can you explain what you saw when the attack happened?
Yeah, well, it was really, if you look at the Pentagon, the way the Pentagon's built, it's a 5-sided structure. And where the plane hit was the westernmost part of the building. And where I was on the opposite side of the building in what they call the E ring. Because if you look overhead picture of the Pentagon, you go from the innermost to the outermost structure of the building. So the innermost is what they call the A ring, right? Then it goes A, B, C, D, E. The E is the outermost ring. So I was on the E ring, what they call the river side of the Pentagon by the Secretary of Defense office. And I was in the National Military Command Post. And we were doing a military exercise, a global, worldwide, massive military exercise. And we were on what's called a red team. And on the red team, I was the human intelligence officer, but we also had 2 pilots, right? One was a former Navy pilot, one was a former Air Force pilot. And we also had a TV on the wall because we were monitoring what was going on in the world. And then we would, if something happened somewhere in the world, we would add that to the exercise, right? We would say, all right, you know, this happened, you guys need to respond or whatever. So what was interesting was I was the only one in the room. We had about 8 people in the room. I was sitting down, everyone else was standing up. And when the plane hit, first of all, we were watching on TV and they had CNN talking about, first they talked about a Cessna, a small private plane that they speculated had hit the World Trade Center. This is the first plane to hit. And on CNN, they were like, oh yeah, it looks like it was a private plane, a small aircraft flew into the World Trade Center. And both of these pilots are like, that ain't what happened. And I asked them, I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, first of all, New York City, the airspace is restricted. You can't just go fly in a Cessna aircraft over New York City. And second of all, that's a really big blast area. And it's not a small plane. So they knew right away something was up, you know. And then when the second plane hit, then it was clear, apparent to everybody, this is not an accident. This is terrorism. And I think it was around maybe 18, 20 minutes later. And then we felt the impact of the aircraft, or actually only I felt the impact because I was sitting down. It was like if you've ever seen like a 6-drawer metal safe, a huge metal safe, right? 6 drawers, so almost like up to your shoulders. It sounded like somebody had knocked a safe over, but instead of it just making a solid, you know, brief boom, it was like boom, and it just reverberated throughout the whole building. So I was on the far end of the Pentagon when that plane hit, and I got to tell you, that's a massive building, the Pentagon, because it was originally built as a book depository. It was built to hold a lot of books, which are heavy. All right, so this thing was about as solid a building as you can imagine. So when that plane hit, what we felt the impact, and we also smelled aviation fuel, because the aviation fuel, it was an airliner full of aviation fuel. And when it exploded, some of the fuel came into the building, you smelled it. So yeah, so then we got led out of the building. The MPs came in and they said, leave your classified documents, don't put it in the safes, don't do anything, just get out of the building. So we went out of the building, and I'll never forget, and here again, this is how many years ago, right? 23 years ago. So as we're filing out of the building, one of the special forces guys on the team, he's looking, we're walking into what they call south parking lot of the Pentagon. So he looks up at these these berms, these grassy mounds. So surrounding the parking lot, you've got like these hills that are just grass, right? And he looks up at these hills, and I'm like, "What are you looking for?" He says, "I'm wondering where they put the claymores." I said, "What are you talking about?" Because understand something, special forces guys, they're trained to do ambushes, they're trained to do this kind of thing. And from based on his training, he came outside, he's like, "Well, if I was doing this, if I was gonna hit the Pentagon, what I would do is I would hit the Pentagon, the building, and then the next thing I would do is I would use claymore mines to target the people that are on the ground in the parking lot, because you've literally got tens of thousands of people milling around in the parking lot, right? Trying to do accountability, figure out from every office, who do we have, who's missing, that kind of thing. And there's nothing to protect them. So that was one of the most memorable. I'll never forget that. You know, where do you? I'm looking for where they put the claymores, because, like I said, if he had been managing that, they'd hit the building, they'd have claymores on the outside, and then they would attack the survivors. So that was kind of an eye-opening thing.
Wow. And
Yeah.
I remember while learning about 9/11, my dad told me that when the when the planes hit the Twin Towers, some people were actually jumping out of the buildings.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, this was tough because you got to understand, cable news was relatively new back then, relatively new. It'd only been around maybe if 10 years, not even 10 years. So cable news was covering this live. And you know, they're showing the buildings, ground level view of the buildings, and you're seeing these black dots coming off the building where people were jumping. And it wasn't apparent right away. People were like, "What are those black dots?" And then they realized what was happening. Because the problem was, if you were above where the planes impacted, you were either going to burn to death or you had to jump. Those are your
Yeah.
choices. What a horrible way to die.
Yeah, and I remember my dad told me that when they hit the ground, it was like a high pitched noise, or either it hit when it either hit the ground or a vehicle like a car.
Yeah, yeah. So very upsetting. We lost more people on 9/11 than we had lost in Pearl Harbor, on the Pearl
Yeah.
Harbor attack. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember over a year ago there were now talk that there might have been a fifth plane involved.
Yes, I've heard that too. I've heard that too. It looks like there was a fifth plane.
Were there any ceremonies that you went to honoring you and the other veterans?
Well, every year here at Mercyhurst, it's not really a ceremony honoring us personally, but we on November 11th, right? We have Veterans Day, and we go out and they raise the flag and they have like a little ceremony, you know, honoring the veterans. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I remember seeing that on Instagram last year.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. So, when did you become a teacher at Mercyhurst University?
It was in August of 2019.
Wow. Okay, that was all my questions.
Okay.
So once again, thank you for your service in the military, Professor Hoffman.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. I recommend it to anybody. You know, it was an interesting life. It kind of shaped who I am as a person. You know, like this morning, I got up at 5 o'clock and did like 4 hours of stuff at home before I even came to work. So, you know, being in the military really impacts how you live your life, how you think about things, you know. But yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah. All right, thanks for your service.
Thank you, Shelby. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.